So in my previous podcast, we talked about sort of my mechanical goals for this card game, and sort of how I wanted to use Magic as a starting point, Magic the Gathering that is, and then to sort of take a step away from that to sort of look to my own experiences with that game and my own sort of assessments of what was successful and what was not successful. Try to take some of those successful elements and sort of carry them forward, and then sort of remove some of the unsuccessful elements. But this time I'd really like to focus more on my thematic goals. So again, so we talked before about how I was really looking to sort of have these highly stylized decks, 3 of them, and to actually have each one, sort of be the embodiment of a character, that we would, really develop, so that when you're playing, you really feel like you're, assuming the role, of this person, and you're trying to achieve their goals, and you're really telling their story, by playing their cards. And, to sort of continue from that, really what I'm looking to do is to really have this idea of, there's 3 players, and they're each going to be sort of competing with one another for the success of their own goals. And so there's really only going to be one winner at sort of the end of the game. But at every moment, you sort of have to make this choice during your turn. You have, sort of one card to play, is what I've been thinking mechanically. And so what are you going to use that card to do? Time is your most, valuable, asset, or I guess in this case, your turn, and that card that you choose to play is your most valuable asset. So, do you help, the person to your left? Do you help the person to your right? Do you hurt the person to your left? Do you hurt the person to your right? Do you just try to help yourself and stay, in everyone's good graces? Or do you sort of screw them both over simultaneously? So really what I was looking to do is to really take this idea of, the Mexican standoff and really incorporate that into the game. And so the Mexican standoff is like this idea from, I think most famously, the movie The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where, sort of in this final, iconic scene, there's these 3 gunslingers that are, getting ready to draw, and they're looking, from eye to eye, the person to their left and right, and they're just trying to decide, who do I draw on, and when do I draw? And, I think it's just a really powerful scene, and really fits in with this idea of sort of trade-offs and trust, and, sort of this ebb and flow of, alliances and, betrayals, and these are all sorts of themes that I'd like to incorporate into the game, and I think it really makes for a really rich sort of gameplay where it's not just you, trying to sort of go through the motions of your own deck, which I feel like a lot of games sort of fall into, where, oh, this is my burn deck, and so at every step, my only goal is to try to, I guess first get energy or land, and then to do damage to the enemy, and that's really all I'm trying to do. And what the enemy's doing might necessitate me to take action against them, insofar as removing a creature or combating them in some way using a counter spell, I suppose, or something like that. But there's really not a whole lot of sort of give and take between the characters. There's certainly no cooperation, and I don't know. I suppose that if you're doing a free for all, there is a certain amount of that, but one of my real goals here thematically is to really have cards that are designed with this sort of standoff, 3-player theme in mind. So, to have cards that will benefit someone, or maybe hurt someone and benefit someone else, so that you're really always, trying to decide, who are you going to focus on. And what I'm imagining will happen when we actually play this game is that, one person will start to get very strong, and their goals will start to sort of come to fruition, and then the other 2 players will sort of turn against them and say, okay, well, this person's getting out of control, we need to team up, maybe temporarily to take them down. And then as sort of some of their strength is sapped away, someone else, one of the other, people from this tentative alliance starts to get strong, and so then, again, the battle sort of shifts. So it's sort of this idea of, not a love triangle, but, I don't know, like a hate triangle or something like that, just the idea of a Mexican standoff. So, what I'm hoping is that there'll really be this sort of fast-paced ebb and flow where one person is sort of getting stronger, then, they get sort of focused down, and then someone else gets stronger, and it shifts. And to really have things be balanced enough that you can really have it be at any moment anyone could sort of step into the lead at their next turn. I feel like most well-designed games are like that. When you play Settlers of Catan, it's like at the end of the game, it's like anyone could have won on their next turn. It's just who gets there first. So really, I think it's a great feeling to not have just one person sort of sprint ahead and sort of stay ahead. but to really have everyone sort of be in the running, and have it really just have this feeling at the end like, oh, even though I lost, I was so close. And that I think that's really what really motivates you to play again and to sort of shuffle the cards and to ask for a rematch, which is really I think what you want people to do when you're designing a game like this. So to really have the game be balanced enough so that you're really able to win at any moment, but also so that if two people are both focusing you and you're sort of become the pariah of the group, that you'll be able to sort of withstand that, and that sort of being focused down right away isn't going to just cripple you for the rest of the game irrecoverably. So you need to sort of keep that in mind when we're designing these cards. But how do you weather that storm, of your enemy's wrath, but then also to sort of, catch back up again. So if you have been sort of forced to the back of the line, how do you sort of claw your way back to the front again? So that's, I think a real hybrid of, I guess mechanical and thematic goals. But, to really get into the thematic goals, what I was really thinking is, this game has to be set into a universe. And especially since I'm trying to stylize it so much, I think that the universe that I choose is very important. So I could sort of try to create my own universe, or I could sort of try to borrow upon one that already exists. And what I really decided to do here is to do the latter, to really borrow from one that already exists. And I'm a big fan of H.P. Lovecraft, and I really love this whole Cthulhu mythos. And I think it's an interesting idea, and I think that there's any game that's really been made within that world has been a very interesting one, because I think that it sort of takes a lot of these sort of fantasy, horror genre ideas, especially within gaming, and sort of flips them on their head. So if you look at sort of what Call of Cthulhu did as a role-playing game to Dungeons and Dragons that it was sort of based upon, is it really flipped it on its head, where instead of being this adventurer who becomes a hero in Dungeons and Dragons, what you really see is that you're playing a normal person in Call of Cthulhu, and you never really become strong enough to really adequately deal with these harsh realities of the monsters that you're facing, and you're sort of expected to fail and to die in that game. And I think that's just a really interesting sort of reversal. So I'd like to really sort of do a similar kind of thing with this, to sort of take magic and turn it on its head, where again you're not this nameless summoner, but you're actually a person. And maybe some of your cards have you interacting with sort of a world that, in terms of trade-offs, like we were talking about before, that might actually be very, dangerous to you. So it's not that you're just this omnipotent person, who's sort of like in control of everything, but that maybe you're actually, I guess, bargaining with dark powers, or you're sort of paying these sort of secret, horrible costs to really get your power, and in that way making these dangerous gambits to get your power and to achieve your goals. But to sort of, I guess, I probably should have done this earlier, but to sort of, I guess, set the stage for what is this Cthulhu mythos. What I'm really talking about is, again, this world of H.P. Lovecraft, where he sort of created this world in which, there's these sort of outer gods that, sort of exist and sort of have this subtle influence on the world. And most people sort of go through their lives without really being aware of this, luckily for them. But, some people, usually, the protagonists in these stories, end up sort of being confronted by them, sometimes by, sort of curiosity killed the cat, sort of investigations, but, sometimes just sort of randomly they sort of happen upon them. And so there's just sort of this idea in the Cthulhu mythos that, there's sort of these horrible truths out there that, in fact, there are these sort of monstrous entities that, are sort of, trying to, sort of take over the world, or are very dangerous to it. And, we're actually very small and, in fact, very, very vulnerable, to their influences, and, both physically, but also sort of, mentally. And so sanity is a really big, theme in these books. And, sort of the idea is that you are, sort of the more that you start to understand, how the world is, the more sort of truth that you get, sort of the worse off it is for you, the greater the costs are to your sanity. Which is, I think, a really interesting idea, that usually, the truth is sort of taken as this really, like ultimate, goal or end to itself that's sort of pure. And so this sort of idea that, maybe there's some truths that are better, sort of rocks better left unturned, and there's sort of terrible consequences for really discovering the truth. And so I think that's also sort of fits into this theme that I had at the beginning, of a trade-off where, yeah, you can get the truth, but, again, what is the cost, to your sanity or to your health? And so, for a lot of these reasons, I think because it's an interesting world, and also because some of the themes that this mythos has sort of run parallel to mine, I thought this would sort of be the perfect setting for this game. And so that's what I sort of decided to go with. And so I think that, insofar as, that is the world that this is set in. I think a lot of my sort of thematic goals are also very much related to what the thematic goals are, or maybe not thematic goals, but themes are for, the Cthulhu mythos. So I think that, again, I think, trade-offs are really important. I think the characters, so as they're interacting in this game with one another, I think there'll be some cards where they're just sort of doing things that they normally would do as characters, and those don't have this, too much of a trade-off or a cost in terms of, sanity or anything like that. But that as they start to sort of, call upon, more power than they themselves could ever really wield, from these sort of dark entities and, these sort of unknown magics that they're coming into contact with, it will allow them to have the power to achieve their goals, but they'll making these great sort of trade-offs. So it's sort of the idea that approximately, or short term they are getting towards their goals, but long term or distally they're really actually working against themselves and sort of giving up maybe some of the things that are most important to them. So sort of my idea was that we'll have these three different characters. They'll have their own sort of feels. They'll be very unique and distinct characters, but all of them will sort of have this common theme where, just like, protagonist and one of these Lovecraft stories sort of has stumbled upon one of these old relics, and through sort of interacting with this relic, they have sort of come in contact with, some of these sort of dark magics and sort of outer god powers, and with that, magic and power that, they've been able to sort of, do things that they wanted to do and sort of, have these achievements, but also they're all starting to sort of, pay these subtle consequences for it, where, they're losing some of their sanity and some of like the bad parts of their personalities are sort of being drawn out to the forefront and, potentiated and intensified. So in addition to there sort of being in most of these games mechanically, magic has life and things like that, I'd also sort of like there to be, sanity, and I really like that to be, a big theme in this game, and to have that be not, I'd like it to be there mechanically, but I'd also like it to really have a feel to it where, again, thematically, as you're telling this story, you have a number, that corresponds to what your sanity is, but you actually see that played out in the game. So, maybe as your sanity gets lower and lower, cards have different meanings or things like that. And I think actually mechanically some of that might play out as well in terms of, if you drop to too low sanity, you might go insane and have, something happen to you. I think that would be really interesting. This sort of changes the rules for you. And again, in sort of a trade-off way, I think would be really interesting where, it's insanity. That's not supposed to be a good thing. And so most of the time, that's going to be detrimental to you, and you sort of a condition that you'd like to escape. But yeah, sort of in that one moment, you might actually choose to do things that sort of bring about your own insanity because you've thought ahead and you understand the rules about what happens when you go insane, and that might actually serve your purposes. Or maybe you have to sort of make this decision where you're able to do what you want, but the consequence, the trade-off is that you go insane. So you sort of weigh that and say, oh, that's worth it. I'm still going to do this. And so sort of, mechanically, again, you're making these trade-offs, but then also sort of, thematically, the character that you're embodying is also making these trade-offs. So I'd really like to sort of, thematically really give these cards some personality. So, as you're making these, mechanical trade-offs, that's also paralleled, really sensical in terms of your themes. So if someone is losing, sanity, like, yes, mechanically that is a trade-off because you don't want to lose sanity in terms of, that being a number that you want to keep high, but also, something is actually happening to them where that makes sense for them to lose sanity, and that actually means something to the character, and then there's also, sort of this idea of, these dangerous gambits that they're making, and they're just sort of so intent on winning this, Mexican standoff that they're in, and really they're so dedicated to achieving these goals that, they're really willing to, make these horrible sacrifices, and maybe part of that is just sort of that's they're the bad parts of their personality being called to the forefront, and maybe it's also sort of this, lack of sanity that they're willing to do these things that maybe they wouldn't have before, and some of these sort of positive parts of the personality are being sort of traded away, or marginalized in order to sort of achieve this goal. And so again, it's just sort of like, mechanically, I want there to sort of be this opportunity to sort of like, you win the game, mechanically, you win it. But then sort of thematically, if you think about what has happened to this character, yes, they've won, they've sort of defeated the other two characters, and since they have their own win conditions, it'll sort of be reflected in, sort of like, if one of the characters was hoping to, like remove one of the other ones from the game, then they do that, they win. But then if you think about how did you win, sort of what are your, what sort of condition are you in now as you're winning? Yeah, maybe you won, but maybe you've gone insane as a result, or maybe you've, done horrible things that have compromised that character's morality, or maybe they've, sort of made some sort of trade-off, or, they've lost their own identity, or they're, they themselves going to die, in a couple of rounds if the game was going to continue. So again, it's sort of telling this, I think rather tragic story most of the time, which again is very much fitting in with the Cthulhu mythos, where again you're sort of you may be able to sort of defeat these these dark powers, or at least send them back, or sort of cast them away. But again, the question always remains at the end, at what cost were you able to achieve that goal? And so I think to really be able to play that out in the game thematically would just be really interesting. So I'm really looking, as we spend some of my further podcasts, about each of the characters, thinking, really explicitly about, what motivates this character? What are they trying to achieve? And how are they going to go about achieving it? And sort of what, trade-offs or sacrifices are they willing to make? And what will those things mean to them? How might they rationalize these choices in the short term? And then again, what will that mean for them in the long term? And so I think that each of them will sort of have, a set of, perhaps at times conflicting goals about, perhaps on one hand, sort of what they're trying to achieve, what their win condition is, but then also sort of what kind of person they are, and so sort of in trying to, achieve that goal, they're going to have to do things, some of which fit with that personality, some of which might actually run very much contrary to sort of how they conceptualize themselves, and, there might be some sort of identity crises that result. That might also play out, really interestingly in the game thematically and perhaps also mechanically. So I'm really looking for this game to sort of take it to the next step. To have this be like a really, I think, psychologically astute game, and to have it be, really interesting and rich and, I think nuanced. Where again, I think that just a game like Magic's not able to achieve this because, again, you're just nameless. You're just a faceless, sort of planeswalker. You don't really have any sort of motivations aside from winning the game. So how could you really tell a story about that person? How could you really, have, like a tragedy or, a triumph play out throughout the course of a game when, there's, it's like trying to write a story without a main character, or while keeping that main character anonymous. So I think that by really introducing this idea of the character and by really stylizing things and trying to tell this story, I think that be able to, really, I think, achieve, again, that level of depth and, nuance that, I think previous games really haven't been able to achieve, in a really accessible way. I think, an argument might be made for Magic that, like, oh, well, it is telling a story, it's just, you have to really think about it. But there's just so many cards available that, unless you're staying within a set and you're really trying to, kind of structure a deck in order to tell a story, it just doesn't, really happen. So I think sort of making that a real goal for this, bringing that to the forefront, and having that be, again, sort of an explicit goal, I think could really make that happen. And then finally, I think that thematically, what I'm really hoping to do is, again, in keeping with the Cthulhu mythos, to really have there be, these sort of bizarre and, in some ways horrible, or sort of shocking cards, to really have this sort of play out as, like a horror story. Which I think is another thing that most of these, games haven't really been. They've mostly been sort of fantasy, and it's like, oh, I'm playing an elf, and I'm giving him a bow, and he's fighting, orcs and things like that. And I'm using, arcane magics that I understand, and I'm, essentially a magician, or a wizard or something, to really have this sort of be, you're a normal person, and you're changing and you're doing things that have real consequences for you. So anyway, I think it's just sort of trying to set it within this really unique universe, and then also just trying to raise that bar for, having this be a really intelligent game, to sort of have there be, maybe some sarcasm, in the cards, or some, dark humor. I think is probably more accurate than sarcasm. But really have this, tell a story that is really engaging. And in fact, every game that you play, as you play different cards and as different people sort of win, you're telling, perhaps the same story, but, there's different outcomes and there's different sort of paths to that outcome. So I'm really hoping that this will be, I think a game that will be, I think really, I guess enriching, or I guess, nutritious, for someone who's, the type of thinker that I like to think of myself as being, which is, again, psychologically astute and really enjoy sort of telling a story and getting involved in, the lore or something like that. But also trying to make that accessible to someone who perhaps, isn't normally like that, or has a little trouble getting into it. So those are really my thematic goals, and I think future podcasts will be, then kind of setting out the specifics about, what do the mechanics look like, what does a turn look like for each player, and how do they interact, what are the rules, and then going into sort of the details of the thematics of, what are each of these three characters going to look like, and again, how do we flesh those out to be, really engaging and interesting characters. So that's sort of the plan, and then finally, I think later podcasts and blog posts will be, actually showing the cards that I'm developing for this game, and maybe I'll actually play it, sort of record video or something like that to sort of show you how it goes. So please look forward to that.